Comic Geek Speak presents Murd's Time Bubble, the 27th time. It's summertime, summertime, some summertime, 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 some summertime, 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 some summertime, summertime. Bum bum bum. Hey there. My name is Adam Murdo. I'm welcoming you back aboard Murd's Time Bubble for the 27th time in a series, sadly infrequent series, but a series nonetheless, here in the opening days of summer 2016. And I find, looking at my little desk calendar aboard the dash of the time bubble, that it has been a rather shameful 8 months since the last one of these little time bubble recordings of mine. Sorry it's taken me so long to swing back by this point of the continuum to meet with all of my little bubble boosters. But I'm here now, and I'm happy, and I'm ready and raring to talk about some comics. For it is, as I pointed out musically, repeatedly, summertime here. Subjectively, of course, time being relative at all points of the continuum. But for me right now, it is June, and a young man's fancy turns to thoughts of comics. And this thought turning was sort of aided a little bit in recent days and weeks by my recent journey, along with my friend Bryant Pants Kritzman, down to Heroes Con 2016 in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I got a chance to talk about comics with lots of our old friends and a few new friends as well. And one question I was asked a few times over was, when are you going to do another one of those time bubbles, Murd? And the answer I had to give them somewhat sheepishly was that it was... Well, finding the opportunity to record these things was a matter of convenience, a matter of necessity, a matter of impetus, of proper motivation, and above all else, a matter of time. Well, it just so happens that all of these spheres aligned properly, both in me and in my circumstances, my schedule, that I am now able to sit down here and record another one of these time bubble things for your enjoyment. And what are these time bubble things? I imagine some of you must be asking. I mean, I'm aware that we at the Comic Geek Speak family of podcasts are picking up new listeners all the time. And as I said a little while ago, it's been quite some time since I've recorded one of these, since Halloween 2015, in fact. Not exactly the average spacing of releases that I would generally hope for. But I'm doing one now, and for those of you who maybe are not familiar with the concept, Murd's Time Bubble is my little sort of vanity solo spin-off podcast in which I, Adam the Murd Murdo, take a little time to talk about comics that I've been reading lately from my massive, I would say Augean at this point, a little reference to the labors of Hercules, a reading backlog, which stems back many long boxes of comics, and I've kept them in the order in which I bought them, and it goes all the way back to my subjective present in reading, is comics that I purchased in 2003. I am still reading comics from that long ago as if they were new to me, because in truth they are. Many of them I skimmed through at the time I bought them, but then I shoved them right into the bottom of my reading backlog pile to be addressed at the appropriate time as I continue to march through them in sequence. And so, since I am so far behind in my reading, it's become kind of a joke with me. It's one of the things that defines me as a capital G geek, I guess, and something I take a lot of ribbing for on the Comic Geek Speak podcast is that I am that far behind, which makes it sometimes a little complicated for me to take part in discussions of more current material, and I do feel a little self-conscious about that. So this is kind of my way to make myself useful in the Comic Geek Speak family, and just take a little time to sit down and talk about things that I have read thoroughly and that I'm familiar with and that are more or less new to me, but are a matter of nostalgia, I would think, for some people listening in, such as yourselves. So you can just think kind of the thing that we do with our off-the-racks reviews on Comic Geek Speak proper, except it's just me sitting here jabbering on and on for a couple of hours about comics that are at least 13 years old or more, because fairly often on board the Time Bubble I do talk about some back issues that I bought 13 or so years ago. So sometimes I'll be talking about things that are even older than the standard time. And in fact, that's the case for most of the things I'm talking about here, because even though I'm caught up to early 2003 with my reading, I'm only caught up to late 2001 with my time bubble reviewing. So I've got a backlog of comics I haven't read yet and a backlog of comics that I haven't reviewed yet. So, yeah. It's a fun, wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey exercise here on board the Time Bubble. And if this sounds like something you'll enjoy and you haven't tried it before, please do stick around. And if you like what you hear, there's 26 other episodes backlog that you can sample at your leisure. But let's get away on this little junket of the Time Bubble. And I'm actually going to begin by deviating from the parameters that I just finished establishing at length here, in that I am going to shift the Time Bubble into forward year a little bit and go past the point of my reviewing, which I mentioned most of what I'll be talking about on this particular installment of the Time Bubble will be from late 2001. But there is something that I just finished reading a couple of weeks ago that actually is cover dated March 2003, which means it probably came out in January of that year, that I thought I needed to bump up and talk about on the Time Bubble as quickly as possible, because it is... it's germane to a tragic occurrence in recent times of comic fandom, and by which I do mean 2016. It ties into the death of Darwyn Cooke, and so as soon as I picked it out of the pile, read it, I decided I'm not going to wait 2 years to talk about this. I'm putting it directly into the next episode of the Time Bubble I record. So it is that we will begin this Time Bubble joint with a comic book from 2003, and it happens to be Marvel Double Shot, issue number 3 of 4. It was a 4-issue miniseries put out by Marvel in 2002 and 2003, and issue number 3 happens to feature some Darwyn Cooke work. It was actually mentioned at thecomicforums.com once or twice as one of Darwyn's more obscure pieces of work. I think Bill Dowdy and Eric Nolan Wethington in particular, two longtime forumites, had a little mini discussion about this issue, and then just like 2 days later, I happened to discover, hey, I'm due to read this. So I hold it here in my hand. It's easily identifiable by the beautiful Joe Jusko cover painting of the Fantastic Four. Some of you, like me, may remember Mr. Jusko as the artist of the Marvel Masterpieces Series 1 collectible trading cards from the early 90s, back in the days when collectible trading cards were still a part of my life, as they were for a time. It was actually the Marvel Universe trading cards, Series 1 and 2, that got me suckered into being interested in and collecting superhero comics back in those days. And I then collected Series 3 and 4 avidly on my own. And I also got the Marvel Masterpieces cards, which had Joe Jusko artwork, and this image of the Fantastic Four on the cover of Marvel Double Shot number 3. Mwah. Fantastic. And so, appropriately enough, the lead story of this issue is indeed a Fantastic Four story. I'm not going to go too much into the who's, how's, when's, why's, and wherefores of the Marvel Double Shot miniseries. I'll talk about that more when I get to the first issue, which I will eventually. But suffice to say for now, it was a 4-issue miniseries, and the gimmick with it was that each of those 4 issues contained 2 11-page stories. Self-contained, continuity need not apply, which became more and more the case as time passed for Marvel's entire line in the first half of the 2000s. But that's a completely different topic. But yeah, the idea was to give certain creative teams a little bit more free rein to just tell fun, off-the-wall little stories featuring some of Marvel's great characters. And stories that wouldn't necessarily fit in any place else. I don't think Marvel was that interested. Well, they were still publishing annuals, but the annuals tended not to have backup stories in them the way Marvel annuals traditionally had. So these are the kinds of things that might have surfaced as backup stories in annuals at the time. But instead, they found their way into, 8 of them found their way into this Marvel Double Shot miniseries. So yes. The 2 11-pagers in this issue were a Fantastic Four story, and the backup is an astonishing Ant-Man story. That is the one with the Darwyn Cooke artwork. I will get to that shortly, but since I am such a stickler for sequence, as you may have divined from my description of my reading habits and my treatment of my backlog, I am going to insist on talking about this comic in order, first the front story, then the second story. And the first story in this issue, Fantastic Four, it's really, it's not so much a Fantastic Four story as the cover would have us believe. Not only do we see an image of all 4 of the Fantastic Four soaring and running into battle, there's also a Fantastic Four logo on there. But when you turn the cover over and look at the first page of the first story, it actually says, Mr. Fantastic and Franklin Richards in The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And, okay, so this story was written by one Jay Nitz, that's Jainitz, Nitz. The artwork is provided by Gurihiru, which is actually not a person, but a studio. It's like an art shop specializing in character design and storytelling, based in Japan. So, predictably, the artwork for this really nifty little story is evidently manga-esque. You know, the style is unmistakably Japanese, but it is a Japanese style that is in sympathy, you might say, with American or Americanized commercial artwork used in commercially printed kids' books, packaging, even some TV animation. So it's an accessible sort of manga style, and even though it's very clearly Japanese in origin, it gets along well with mainstream American tastes of the time. But yeah, it's kind of an example of, one of several examples of Marvel's attempts to flirt with what was then thought of as a manga and anime craze in the early 2000s. Of course, manga and anime had been available in English language editions for consumption for quite a long time before the early 2000s, but I like to think of Pokemon as being kind of the breakwater, the watershed moment there for mainstream culture becoming a little more aware of these things. And even though that craze, we'll call it, subsided a bit, it did have its effect in that nowadays North American consumers of manga and anime are a much larger and more vocal body or subgroup of geekdom in this country than they'd ever been before. There are a lot more Japanese media conventions happening in this country than used to. But in the early days, as Marvel attempted to tap into this, the results were really not what I would call strong successes. There's the Marvel Mangaverse thing that they tried to do. There's this. There were a couple of other like little mini-series experimental things that used Japanese-style artwork. And they just never – they kept trying, but they never quite forded the gap between taste preferences and audiences. They didn't find the crossover they needed. What they did with the Marvel characters and the anime style didn't really appeal to manga or anime fans or to traditional Marvel fans, and the end result was that they weren't very successful overall. And one of the driving forces, probably the strongest proponent at Marvel for this initiative would have been C.B. Cebulski, who was an editor at Marvel for a while. He was in charge of the aforementioned Marvel Mangaverse thing, and he is actually listed as a consulting editor for this story. You know, the miniseries as a whole was edited by Tom Brevoort. But this story cites C.B. Cebulski as a consulting editor. Not surprising, since he would have been the one to bring in the Japanese talent. Also, a credit is given for Aki Yanagi as translator for the Marvel editorial staff to communicate with the artists at Gurihiru. So here we are, and it is an 11-page story with this sort of manga-esque, kiddie-friendly for the kids of 2003 story, and I would definitely classify it as an all-ages story. It's a good thing to give young people, although I'm not really sure how many young people actually got a chance to read this story. But I would hope that at least a few of them did. So yeah, the story is called The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, written by Jay Nitz, and it's a father and son type story, something that my fellow CGS geek Shane would probably tear up over a little bit, since he is a father, and he's also a fairly devout Catholic. And the story is about, young Franklin Richards. It begins with him sitting in front of a big bank of monitors, trying to watch television, except about half of the monitors have had their regularly scheduled programming preempted for news bulletins about a terrorist attack in the Gaza Strip. And Franklin is then shown running into his daddy's lab, where Mr. Fantastic is hard on work on some gizmo hickey or something, as Ben Grimm would say. And he asks he informs Reed about the terrorist attack at the Gaza Strip, and Reed immediately starts musing about the tragic loss of human life. And Franklin interrupts and says, "Why did God let that happen?" And at first, Reed doesn't quite hear the question in the spirit that Franklin asks it, and he, without shifting out of like super rational, logical, analytical mode, he starts to give a scientific explanation for how bombs work. And then Franklin goes on to say, "Mom says things happen because of God's plan. She says that's why Uncle Ben is orange." And I think it's the mention of his wife's name, Franklin's mom, Sue, that gives Reed Richards pause for a moment, and he finally is able to temporarily snap off the scientist in himself and think more as a father and as a person responsible for a young child's spiritual and moral education. And then, what follows then, Reed leads little Franklin over to one of the devices in his lab, which is, in effect, a little holodeck. It's like or even a Wayback Machine for you fans of Jay Ward out there, a little more appropriate for the time bubble. But it's a simulator, a virtual reality simulator, and he uses it to take Franklin on a little illusory journey through time and space to explain to him about some of the origins of religion and spiritual belief on planet Earth in the Marvel Universe, much of which is applicable to the real world too, of course, and also about the at times shaky and contentious relationship between religion and science, and it ends with it ends with Reed going into his personal views, as per Jay Nitz, the writer of this story, about how those two bodies of knowledge, of science and religion, are not necessarily mutually exclusive or incompatible. How he believes that it's love in the end, as embodied in Reed's case by Franklin's mother Sue, that bridges the gap between the two, and that he feels that there is room for both in this world, and so he goes out of his way to instill this in Franklin. And so it's a very nice, if slightly sappy at points, attempt to literarily reconcile science and religion. It's well stated and respectful to multiple points of view. It even takes into account the specific history and theography of the Marvel Universe. Yeah, so in addition to just the spiritual philosophies of real people like Gandhi or Einstein, we're also shown, how the conversation about religion might differ in a place like the Marvel Universe, where Asgardians and Olympians and Galactus the World Devourer are running around. So, yeah, so not only is this applicable to our world, there are concessions made to Marvel history, and it's a little wordy, but it kind of needs to be to get this whole thing in the 11 pages of space accorded to it. It doesn't really get preachy or anything like that, and it's even though the prose is a little dense at times, it never moves beyond all ages accessibility in its language, which is something of an accomplishment in itself for Jay Nitz. So I really like the project of this story. The tone is a little pedagogical. To me, it seemed advertently similar to good old educational comics, or even like a Mark Trail strip. If it were on television, you could probably look for the little EI, educational instructional bug up in the corner. But for 11 pages, it's a pretty tight little history or etiology of religion, very tightly encapsulated and simplified, and not only about religion, but about its relationship with science. And I have to think that Mr. Nitz, if he hasn't read a particular article that I read while I was in grad school by a man named Bronislaw Malinowski. It was called The Role of Myth and Religion. If he hasn't read it, he's come to a couple of the same conclusions on his own that Malinowski did. In that Malinowski went, several points he made in that article. It's one of the favorite things of mine that I read while I was in grad school at Bowling Green, earning my master's in popular culture studies. One of his main points was to try and debunk the commonly held idea that somehow science was evolving from and supplanting religion, that it existed further along a kind of epistemological evolutionary scale from religion or mythology. Malinowski's point was that these two things have actually always existed simultaneously throughout human history. Human beings have always had access to both scientific and mytho-religious explanations for the world around them. And it's not so much that one is evolving from the other, it's that the two of them have evolved parallel to one another since time immemorial. This story by Jay Nitz is kind of going in that same direction and revealing to us that these two things have always been around. They both serve essential human needs in their own way, and that there's space for both of them in the lives of everyday human beings, and even in the lives of fantastic ones like the Richardses here. And I kind of like the whole love is the answer coda at the end, where we bring things back to the Fantastic Four specifically. And it's a reinforcement of, and kind of a tribute to as well, the Fantastic Four's family dynamic. You know, if Reed is the brains of the group, and there's very little question that he is, Sue is the soul. She's the one that helps to... She establishes the bonds of love that bind the often squabbling and fractious Fantastic Four together as a family unit. And I was just happy to see that Reed took the time to explain this issue to Franklin in this way, in this story. This is a Reed Richards I'd be comfortable sharing a universe with. And just to drop a little bit of snarkle on the way here, I kind of wish Jonathan Hickman had felt that way and had written some of his Fantastic Four material more towards this. Some of the attitudes I thought I saw expressed in his work with the Fantastic Four was a bit of a turnoff for me, and I think if he'd taken a few more cues from the way Nitz approached the issue of science and religion in this story, I'd have liked it a little better. Although I did read the recent Secret Wars miniseries that Marvel put out and that Hickman wrote, which ends with Reed and his family out in some other dimensional zone. I think might even have been the negative zone. I don't remember. But they're out there together. They're sort of written out of the Marvel Universe temporarily, and it's kind of a touching scene between Reed and his young ones. And I feel like Reed has gotten a little of his heart back, and so Hickman sort of skews Richards back in the direction of this story, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, in the end, since that's the Secret Wars is supposed to be kind of like the finale to this massive multi-year, multi-series arc that he's been doing with the Fantastic Four and some of the cosmic elements of the Marvel Universe. I'll also say that I kind of liked what Matt Fraction did with the Fantastic Four in his FF series a while ago. I'm thinking of one scene where Franklin and a bunch of the other little kids from the Future Foundation are sitting down to dinner, and their grace consists of Franklin beginning, "Dear God," or the quantum improbability theory, or a random mass of Higgs bosons, and he just goes through this whole different bunch of teleological possible theories for the origins of the universe and the place of a supreme being therein. So he's really covering a bunch of different perspectives, and I was sort of gratified that, as a believer in God myself, that he began with God, maybe just because it's the most succinctly statable, or the oldest of the theories being evoked in that little grace prayer. That was a little more funny and playful on Fraction's part, and I too would take that over most of Hickman's run as far as treatment of this particular subject. But yeah, Jay Nitz did it in a very quaint and touching way, and this is a story that a friend of mine is actually she's devoutly religious, and she's also a scholar, and she and her husband, who is a computer programmer and also a religious person, they're working. It's sort of a pet cause of theirs now to spread awareness about the possible reconciliation of or reconcilability of science and religion. And this is I would consider giving this story to them as like a teaching material to young people. I thought it was very well done and just very sweet as well. And that's only the first story in this issue. Now we get to the reason why I decided this needed to be included sooner than later on the time bubble. The second story features Scott Lang, the astonishing Ant-Man, in the astonishingly dated title, "Who Let the Dad Out?" This is 2003, and it's a feature of the story that we're told how dated the Baha Men's hit song "Who Let the Dogs Out" already was about a year and a half after it was released. But that's where the title of the story comes from. Now, this is written by one Sean McKeever, who is actually kind of a friend and acquaintance of the CGS group from a little over 10 years ago when we first got started as a podcast. He was a friend of Mike Norton's. Mike Norton's was a friend of ours. We met up with him at a New York con back in 2007. Got to know him. He was a real nice guy. But that was a couple of years after he had gotten this story published. And the artwork, well, the pencils at least, are, of course, by the late Darwyn Cooke. Inks by Mike Manley, and Lee Lowridge provides the colors. And it's a story about Scott Lang, the Ant-Man, and not as a superhero, really. It's but as a dad. It's a sweet, funny, believable little story in which we learn about a little more about Scott Lang as a parent, and it's also kind of an important continuity benchmark in that we get to see a little bit of Scott's daughter, Cassie Lang, growing up. Too often in comic books, since they are kind of a sister medium to the densely serialized soap opera medium, one of the bad habits of soap operas that too often finds its way into comic books is that kids aren't allowed to grow up normally. They tend to either get, in comic books, too often they're killed off, or before they ever get a chance to grow up, or they're obliged to grow up at soap opera warp speed. My mother, when I was very young, used to watch soap operas out of desperate boredom. They were far below her intellectual level, but she watched them anyway, just because she had little else to do while she was stuck at home with me. And she told me, years later, when we had a conversation similar to this about how kids were treated in comics and in soap operas, that all too often on the soap opera she watched for just a few years when I was young, characters would have children, And within 5 seasons of that soap opera, they would suddenly be teenagers and out having like romantic affairs of their own, and possibly, having kids of their own too. So it was kind of absurd. So it just kind of seems that too many writers or showrunners or editors, I guess, in the case of comics, tend to view kids, or young kids anyways, little better than dead weight or story poison at worst. And so they seem irrationally reluctant to allow these kids to either stay kids for long, or to allow them to have – they're either too rapidly aged up into teenagers, or they're just not allowed to develop any kind of personality as children until they turn into teenagers, or they're just killed off. And none of which is really that positive a trend, I think. So here we have a somewhat young Cassie Lang. I think she's supposed to be 11 years old in this story. So we get to see what her relationship with her single dad, Scott, is at this point in Marvel time, in 2001. So she's getting ready to go to her first boy-girl co-ed party. Being hosted by the mother of her friend Lynn. And Scott is not treating the news well. He doesn't like the outfit that Cassie has picked out for herself. We very quickly discovered that there's no helicopter parent, like the kind who can shrink to near-invisible microscopic size and command flying ants. Because he very quickly decides that he needs to tag along and spy on Cassie as she goes to this party. And so... And that's what he does, and by the end of it, he realizes that the error of his own ways. He overhears Cassie saying a few things that makes him think about his own childhood and the amount of latitude that his parents allowed him. He basically grew up to be a criminal. It's more complicated than that, but his parents had enough trust in him to let him make his own mistakes, and certainly he made more than his share of them. But in the end, he decided he wasn't going to allow Cassie to make as many mistakes as he did, but he could at the very least trust her to just have a good time without him hovering over her all the time. And so he flies gleefully off into the night at the end of this story, singing, "Who let the..." Apparently when Cassie's little 11-year-old date showed up to take her to the party, Scott made a little reference to the Baja Men's Who Let the Dogs Out and mortally embarrassed Cassie. So that kind of became the theme of the story, and as I said, that's where the title comes from. So at the end of it, Scott is in microscopic size running away from a pet dog and singing, "Who let the dogs out? Woof, woof, woof." Yep, like I said, even in 2003, this was dated. But that's part of the fun. Sean McKeever kind of impresses me with his scripting skills here. I mean, he's sort of, in the years following this, began to make a bit of he sort of staked his career on writing dialogue for young characters. And the words he put in Cassie's mouth are very believable to me here. It's some of the best preteen, I refuse to use the word tween, preteen dialogue I think I've ever read in comics. There's one part where Scott demands to know where Cassie got the rather revealing little belly-bearing tank top she's wearing, and she responds, "I got it at the mall with Lynn." Lynn is Lynn's mom even picked it out for me. Thank you very much. And so the little question mark, because that's how he punctuates it. That's how he renders pre-adolescent up-talking. Any of you who either have or have been around sassy little girls know that's kind of how they talk to the tragically unhip, i.e. their parents or any other older people or just uncool peers. They try to lead them along the path to the obvious by ending every sentence with a question mark, and McKeever picked up on that and put it in there. That is one word balloon that stuck with me over the years as I waited for this to rise to the top of my reading pile. It's because it was this kind of naturalistic, imitative scripting was really a lot less common in 2003 than it is these days, and it really kind of grated on me a little bit just how accurately annoying he made little Cassie in that panel. And she's not overly annoying in the story as a whole. I just kind of wanted to smack her a little bit in that one panel, and that I think is probably what McKeever was going for. So, but yet we learn as the story unfolds that Cassie actually... She tells, as she hugs her dad goodbye, that she tells him that she made some spaghetti for him and it's keeping warm in the oven. So here's overprotective dad Scott, and we learn that he's kind of dependent on his little girl to cook for him. So it gives you an idea what kind of relationship they have and how the the power in the household is not necessarily strictly top-down one way, which is good. This is kind of a real relationship. And Cassie has a real personality, which, as I've said, is more than a lot of younger people in comics are allowed to have. So it's a little refreshing in that way. And the general tone of the story is, as I said, it's not really so much a superhero story as it is a family story, and it kind of reminds me of an episode of like an old-timey sitcom, maybe even an animated one from the 60s or 70s, starring Scott Lang as the gruff, now loud-mouthed, obtusely authoritarian dad struggling to keep his little girl in check, like a I don't know, maybe a Jackie Gleason or a Fred Flintstone, and then there's the artwork, how that kind of merges into that. So of course I have to spend a certain amount of time talking about the art because it is Darwyn Cooke, and as I've said, it's one of probably his lesser-known published stories, but the feel he gives to this, he's a master of visual humor. I mean, not everything that Darwyn Cooke has published gives him a chance to show off that particular set of skills, but it's certainly in center stage in this story. And he's got that master cartoonist's knack for making a tiny little line or speck in the middle of a character's face speak volumes about character. And that gift is certainly shared by his inker in this story, Mike Manley, who is a close personal friend of Eric Nolan Wethington, apparently, and who is also the artist of... one of my, I collect sketches of Bizarro, who is my favorite character, and Mike Manley drew for me at a Baltimore con several years ago what I think is the jewel of my collection. It's a very Silver Agey image of Bizarro using his grinning from ear to ear and using his cold vision to destroy a rubber ducky that he's holding in his hand. It makes no sense, which is exactly why it makes perfect sense for Bizarro. So, yeah, I've kind of been a devotee of Mike Manley for that reason, if not for other things he's published, which I have seen and loved. But yeah, his inks are perfect on Darwyn Cooke's artwork here. It really brings out the comedic chops that Darwyn already possesses. And you also get a few little snatches of noir here and there, too, as Scott Lang allows his lack of trust in his daughter, his fatherly, paternal paranoia to drag him down in a spiral to madness. So you see this, there's some panels of Scott sort of internally hallucinating about what a horrible delinquent punk that Cassie's little 11-year-old date might turn out to be. And so there's an image of his head in the foreground in front of this little square grid of 4 panels of him imagining the worst about this kid who shows up to take his daughter to a party. And so it's kind of the descent into madness that the protagonist of a noir film might experience. And so Cooke is able to use a little bit of that talent of his in this particular story as well. And then there's Mara. Mara is a flying ant, who appears to be one of Scott Lang's favorites in this story. He spends most of his dialogue is actually with Mara, because he's caught up, as I said, in paternal paranoia as he was. He was really not talking. He wasn't really hearing Cassie as she talked to him. Was more talking at her than to her. Most of his actual dialogue in this story is with Mara, the flying ant, and she speaks to him in little sort of scribbly glyphs, which he can understand, but we the readers can't, and. So she's kind of like his gal Friday in this story, and he rides off to rescue Cassie from whatever danger she's experiencing at this party on the back of Mara. And it's just fun to see his interactions with her. That's a kudos to McKeever again. But the way Darwyn Cooke draws Mara, the ant, is very Kirby-esque. He's just kind of the way Kirby would draw insects or monsters or animals. They all kind of look blocky and a little bit like they were carved out of rock. Part of the credit for that probably belongs to Manley, but it's just evocation of Kirby is a good way to go in any story in the Marvel Universe in general, really. So yes, artistically satisfying, just a fun, sweet little read on the story side. Darwyn was kind of reminding me of... The art he turned in for the story is worthy of a UPA animated short from the 50s, and that is as surely a compliment. So if you're not aware of this story and you're sort of mooning over the recent and horribly premature passing of Darwyn Cooke and would like to see something a little off the beaten path that he has done in the past, look for Double Shot. It's officially titled Marvel Double Shot, but it just says Double Shot on the cover. So depending on where you shop for back issues, it could be filed under either D or M, number 3 of 4. And look for that Joe Jusko Fantastic Four cover painting and the little astonishing Ant-Man image up in the upper right-hand corner of the cover. You'll be glad you did. R.I.P., Mr. Cooke. Okay, on to selection number 2. We're going to zip back to the... our proper place along the timeline here, going back to late 2001, a comic cover dated October 2001, actually. And it's going to be a DC this time. I'm alternating in this episode. I wasn't buying a whole lot of independent at this point in my reading career. Getting involved in Comic Geek Speak in mid-2005 into 2006 changed that very much for me, as I was introduced to more and more independent creators and also to DCBService.com. But as of 2001, I was, still in college for one thing, and was kind of limited as to what my local comic shop, The Comic Swap, was ordering in, and it is still one of the best comic shops I've ever patronized, so not to downplay them. They did have a decent number of independent press titles around, given the selection that was available in 2001, but I personally wasn't digging into them all that much. So mostly Marvel and DC to talk about. And if you're talking about DC in late 2001, you're going to have to be talking about Our Worlds at War. Yes, that was the mega event that DC did that year, and I've sort of skirted or addressed tangentially the issue of Our Worlds at War a few times here on the Time Bubble, and I guess I can't do a time bubble about this time period without doing at least one crossover. So the one I've selected for this installment is Wonder Woman, Our Worlds at War, Special Number 1. It's part of the all-out war phase of the Our Worlds at War event, so it's pretty late into the event, and it's just after the tragic and, of course, temporary death of Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons, and Wonder Woman's mother, which took place in Wonder Woman number 172, shortly before this hit the stands. And this is a 48-page... I can't call it a self-contained story because it's part of a massive crossover event, so of course it references things that happen elsewhere. And this particular one-shot is very, very, very referential because it doesn't just... its connection to the Our Worlds at War event is fairly minor and incidental when all is said and done. But yeah, it's a 48-page special. It's entitled Inspiration, and it's written by Phil Jimenez, so it's very much a part of Phil Jimenez's then-current Wonder Woman monthly run. It ties into mentions several of the things that he created and implemented in that series. The artwork, interesting assortment of creators. First off, we have Cliff Chiang, turning in what I think is his first work on the character, and this just about exactly 10 years before he and Brian Azzarello took over on the New 52 Wonder Woman series. But here's Cliff Chiang penciling the lion's share of this issue, actually, and with an assist from two members of the CGS fraternity in good standing, Jamal Igle and Cousin Buzz, each of them turning in several pages. Much of the issue is flashbacks, so I think Jamal and Buzz primarily did the pages that are set in the present day, the ones that have the most to do with Our Worlds at War. And the whole thing is, rests resplendent beneath the inks of Wade von Graubiger, 2015 Inkwell Award recipient. And it's all underneath a cover by Jay Lee. That's right, I said Jay Lee, Jaeelee, Jay Lee. He did a Wonder Woman image for the cover of this comic. The story is placed firmly and unmistakably, if not without some undue editorial force, since this is a part of a big crossover, amid Jimenez's regular Wonder Woman run. But it's also a part of Our Worlds at War. The framing sequence involves a delegation of Amazons from a place called Bana Migdal, which is like a rival tribe of Amazons descended from Hippolyta's sister Antiope. And they're like a rival group. They're like the pole branch of the family, you might say, of Amazons. They're from their stronghold, their fortress is called Bana Migdal. This is where Artemis, the replacement Wonder Woman of the 90s, was from. Artemis does appear in this issue. So a delegation from Bana Migdal, which translates to Temple of Women, we're told in the story, they're loitering about Themyscira, listening to stories from Amazonian historian and bard Nemazene, which is also the name of the Titaness of Memory, so it's appropriate for someone whose job is to remember history and tell stories about it from memory. She regales the assembled Amazons from both Themyscira and Bana Migdal about the history of the Amazons, and they're all doing this while awaiting military intelligence crucial to the Amazons' future role in the Imperiex War, which is another word for the big conflagration that is the story spine of the Our Worlds at War event. This big intergalactic conqueror and destroyer named Imperiex, who is a little bit of Galactus, a little bit of Mongol, a little bit of dark side, a little bit of completely forgettable. Anyway, so this war is about him and his aggressions. Apparently, he's forming a pact with Darkseid at about this stage in the story, which gets the Amazons' dander up because they have recently suffered some pretty severe losses at the hands of Darkseid in a recently published DC story, which pitted the Amazons against Darkseid. And so, as the story wears on, it's an illustrated recap, pretty much, of the entire post-crisis history of the Amazons, with emphasis on the history of Diana herself, Wonder Woman, and of her mother Hippolyta, naturally, as told by Jimenez, through Nemazini. There are a few facts that Jimenez doesn't work in here, a few things omitted, a few others that are shuffled or cluded or recontextualized, and even some new details added, which is all par for the course in a epic historical or rehistorical retelling of this size and scope. It's pretty densely written. It's kind of hard to get away from that, but there are a lot of words on the page here. I guess because Jimenez wasn't doing the artwork, he could focus a little more on doing the historical research and writing it all out. It covers everything from the Greek mythological prehistory of the Amazons. It covers Diana's winning of the contest that made her the representative to man's world. It covers Artemis's taking of that title from her. It's got the War of the Gods in there. It's got Donna Troy and all the rest of John Byrne's tortuous, self-satisfied nonsense. So it kind of can't be anything else but dense. I'm a little bit relieved that Jimenez, who is such a huge Donna Troy fan, limited himself to one page about her in this story. So good for you, Phil, for the self-restraint there. And in the midst of all this, there's kind of a weird, almost a non sequitur, a weird interlude showing us Hippolyta's time as the 1940s Golden Age Wonder Woman, because that was a post-crisis recon. That for a time there was no such thing as a Golden Age Wonder Woman because there was no longer an Earth 2. So Golden Age versions of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and a few others simply were not a part of the post-crisis DC history. Then John Byrne came along and had the bright idea of having Hippolyta assume the costume of Wonder Woman and, for reasons I don't quite remember anymore, go back in time and serve as a World War II-era Wonder Woman as penance for betraying the trust of Diana. So it was that Hippolyta, or Polly as she was called by her friends, became the Golden Age Wonder Woman. And so Wonder Woman was reinserted into the 1940s World War II portion of DC's post-crisis timeline. And we do get a little sequence of her and a few guest members of the Justice Society back in the 40s going up against Villainy Incorporated, which is a Golden Age team or supergroup of Wonder Woman villains, actually from the Golden Age, as created by William Moulton Marston and Harry Peter, the original Wonder Woman creative team back in the 40s, back in the days when villain teams were not unheard of. There were a few of them around, but somewhat rare. And Jimenez took it upon himself to revive the concept of Villainy Incorporated. This leads directly into a Villainy Incorporated story that Jimenez would do in May through September of 2002, just like 6 months after this comic was published in Wonder Woman number 179 through 183. So we get to see the Golden Age Wonder Woman fighting Villainy Incorporated back in the Golden Age in a little interlude here, which contains a nested flashback further back into the 40s and gives us a little extra insight into the personality of Priscilla Rich, the Golden Age cheetah. Yeah, so the story structure gets away from Jimenez a little bit there. It's a little off-putting, but still, it's all part of the same history, even if the structure's a little awkward. As I said, it's mostly all about recapping the history and celebrating the history of the Amazons and of Hippolyta. The connection of Our Worlds at War is really limited to a little tacked-on scene at the end as the Amazons learn of Hippolyta's death, and we see a little image of Diana cradling Hippolyta in her eagle-winged golden battle armor, holding Hippolyta's badly scorched and burned body as life passes from it. And, of course, we know Hippolyta will be back eventually. At this point, I've read as far as 2003. I still don't really know how Hippolyta manages to return from the shadowy realm of Tartarus and rejoins her daughter and her people. It's bound to happen eventually. But for now, we have no choice but to just read this and Actually, we do have a choice. I was going to say we have no choice but to read, accept things as we see them, and mourn along with Diana, but no, we all knew that this was going to be permanent. But for the time being, I accepted the opportunity to get a Phil Jimenez-written little history lesson about the Amazons in the post-crisis DC universe. Yeah, truth to tell, the whole little concluding scene where the Amazons are galvanized into action against Imperiex by learning of Hippolyta's death, it sort of felt disingenuous to the point of fraud, honestly, especially the little caption at the bottom of the very last page, which reads, "In Memoriam Hippolyta, R.I.P. 1941 to 2001. Great way to celebrate Wonder Woman's 70th anniversary. Kill her mom. Yeah, even if it is temporary, it's just, putting that on there just felt kind of tasteless to me, since we all knew darn well that this death wouldn't last. And the very last page, not a story page, a text page at the end, where we're also treated to little hype cover images of other Our Worlds at War tie-ins coming out in the near future. There's also a little Daily Planet, quote-unquote, article written by Perry White about, celebrating in prose the death of Hippolyta, and that too was it didn't increase the perceived value of the story in my book. So yeah, that happened. But yeah, the story as a whole, I'm a comics history buff, and I appreciate a chance to have some facts that I didn't know represented for my benefit, and even a couple of new details or wrinkles added. One example, I mentioned the title of this story is Inspiration, something that I'm pretty sure Jimenez innovated for this story, is to introduce sort of a loop of inspiration, how a handful of Wonder Woman family members sort of inspired one another at different points in the timeline. So it's another one of these timey-wimey things. Some of the credit has to go to John Byrne, since he's the one who gave us the idea that Hippolyta went back in time and became the Golden Age Wonder Woman post-crisis. So I'm trying to figure out. It's kind of a chicken or the egg situation, so I'm not sure where to begin to tell the story. But we're told that Diana gets the inspiration of to become Wonder Woman from the 1940s champion of the same name, and how her mother, Hippolyta, was inspired to name her Diana based on another champion of the Amazons, whose name happened to be Diana. So then we're told that Hippolyta, inspired by her daughter, who at that point in continuity was dead, and Hippolyta was racked with guilt over having betrayed her and having not made peace with her before Diana temporarily died. Hippolyta then imposed this penance upon herself of becoming the new Wonder Woman. She went back in time to the 40s. She inspired an aerialist named Diana Rockwell Trevor, who happens to be Steve Trevor's mother in the post-crisis continuity. She became an American military aerialist. She ended up crashing on Themyscira, and she assisted the Amazons in recaging an ancient Greek monster from, I think it's called a Chiromanos, a hundred-handed Hecaton Kyrie, here it is, one of a few evils that were imprisoned beneath Paradise Island. This was something that was established at the very beginning of the Greg Potter and George Perez Wonder Woman run of the mid-'80s, post-crisis. So she helped the Amazons fight this thing back into its vault beneath Themyscira, died in the process, and so she turned out to be the champion that inspired Hippolyta to name Diana Diana. So she inspired Hippolyta to name Diana Diana. Diana was inspired by Diana Rockwell Trevor and by her mother, the Golden Age Wonder Woman. She then, in turn, inspired her mother to become the Golden Age Wonder Woman, who then inspired Diana Rockwell Trevor. And so it's this self-contained, eternal, feminist chicken or the egg, a glorious super feminist chicken or the egg conundrum with just women inspiring women inspiring women inspiring women inspiring women, all over and over again throughout this little pocket of history. It's a lovely little twist that Jimenez threw in there. I'm sure Gloria Steinem would approve. I think possibly even William Moulton Marston would have approved. But yeah, so it's just it's cutting masculinism completely out of the equation. It's very appropriate for the Wonder Woman mythos. I don't think much was done with it as a story detail afterwards, but it's nice to have it in this story anyway. And the artwork, you've got some lovely minimalist sort of retro-styled art from Cliff Chang. And Wade von Graubager's inks give the whole. It gives the whole story, at least all of it, especially the flashback sequences, which are most of the issue. Von Graubager gives it that inky patina of times past. Since this is, after all, an inker who worked on Starman for the first 4 years or so of the book's run. So if you like the way his inks looked over the pencils of the various pencilers of that series over its first 48, 50 or so issues, if you like how that was evocative of sort of moody, atmospheric, and nostalgic, but it's kind of the same effect here over Cliff Chang's pencils, and yet it looks good. So yeah, this is actually, for me at least, it was one of the more enjoyable tie-ins for the Our Worlds at War mega event, and that's why I decided I'd single it out for a little extra love here on this installment of the Time Bubble. Now, let's go back over to Marvel, specifically the Marvel Knights imprint, which absolutely still existed in 2001 and was it was the home of some of Marvel's best-selling titles at that time. So this is Daredevil, Volume 2, this is the Marvel Knights series, issue number 21, again cover dated October of 2001. And this is, oddly, this is not the way I usually do things when it comes to buying comics. I have been known to dip in and out of certain series, just buy an arc or two and then jump off immediately afterwards, instead of just collecting from month to month. But I don't usually dip in and out of arcs. But this is an occasion when I bought one issue of the then current story arc. This is actually part 2 of a 6-issue story called Playing to the Camera. The creative team for this arc, the writer is actually Bob Gale. It's kind of fitting that I'm reading this year, because Bob Gale, who has been dipping in and out of comics since 1998, he's been doing like a Batman story here, a Spider-Man story there, a Daredevil story here, and right now he's gone over to IDW to write Back to the Future comics for them, apropos because he was the screenwriter of the Back to the Future movies. So he knows his way around a Back to the Future story, surely, and he doesn't do a bad job with superheroes either. I kind of like what I saw of his work in this one issue, as I'll mention in a moment, but it's fitting that I should be talking about this now, because this 2016 is the year in which I, Adam C. Murdo, finally sucked it up, sat down and watched the entire Back to the Future trilogy, not all at the same time, spaced out over a couple of weeks, but I finally, after all these years on this planet Earth, without having seen a single Back to the Future movie all the way through, watched all of them on VHS. Thanks again to Tom Mr. Fusion Martinek for providing me with the wherewithal to do that. But now I've experienced some of Bob Gale's comic work, too, within the same year. How about that? Well, actually, I read this some time ago, but I'm talking about it now. So while Bob Gale material is fresh in my mind, it's fitting that I should be doing this now. The artwork, the pencils anyway, are by Phil Winslade, who had actually collaborated with Bob Gale once before. Shortly before this, they worked together on another Marvel Knights comic, the one-shot Ant-Man's Big Christmas special. And Phil Winslade's art has been a little bit divisive among the CGS geeks. I kind of think Brian Deemer doesn't like it. One of my fellow geeks didn't like it. I've never had a problem with it. And once again, I've never been that great at discussing artwork. You may find that if this is your first Time Bubble trip, that I do spend a lot more time going on and on about story structure and the things that the writer does, and then I sort of devote like 3 sentences to the artwork as kind of an afterthought. And I am sorry about that. It's not that I don't mean to diminish in any way the importance of the artists as storytellers. It's just I tend to lack the vocabulary to talk about art. And in fact, sometimes I find myself reduced to saying no more about a particular artist's work than to say, hey, this artist reminds me of this other artist. And that's kind of the case with Phil Winslade. He reminds me of Brent Anderson's fairly realistic work on the Astro City series with Kurt Busiek. In this, I've seen work of his elsewhere that I've liked a little more. I think maybe James Hodgkins, the inker, is throwing it off a little bit for me. But anyway, and the colorist is Chris Chukri. So there we are. And the cover, very striking, I'd even call it a cubist cover, by David Mack, who had been the writer-artist for an arc of this same volume of Daredevil just maybe several months before issue number 21 came out. And he provides the cover for issue number 21. Well, as I said, this is part 2 of a 6-part story entitled Playing to the Camera, and this arc is kind of sandwiched in between Brian Michael Bendis' first and second arcs on Daredevil. So it's Bendis has never been a favorite creator of mine. I grudgingly admit that if he's going to come into the Marvel Universe and do his thing with any character therein, Daredevil is one of the best because Daredevil is adjacent to crime noir, and that's one of Bendis' favorite things. So I will grant him that Daredevil was a book that he deserved to write, and I'm glad that he wrote so many issues of it and the people loved it so much. When I began to resent him is when he started taking over, well, pretty much every single piece of real estate in the Marvel Universe, writing the X-Men, writing the Avengers, basically charting the destiny of the entire Marvel Universe. That's when I started to get a little grumbly. But that's all pretty safely in this objective future of the time bubble. It's just 2001, and Brian Michael Bendis hasn't completely even taken over Daredevil yet. So even though I do acknowledge that he was a good choice to write Daredevil, and he probably had done some quality work on the series in the early 2000s, I really didn't feel like reading it. So this is actually the final issue of Daredevil that I would buy for most of the rest of that decade. I think I dipped into a couple of Ed Brubaker's stories later on, but I picked up... No, that's not true. There is one other. There was that very cheap... like 10 cent, I think, or maybe even less than that, issue of Daredevil. It was the first part of the Low-Life story that Bendis wrote. So you'll probably hear about that in a future episode of the Time Bubble. But other than that, this issue number 21 of the Marvel Knights Daredevil was the last Daredevil comic I'd pick up for a while. And why did I buy the second issue of a 6-issue arc, you may ask? Because I happened to be aware that it featured the Jester, one of my idiosyncratic favorite Marvel villains. And you can tell that it's a Jester story because David Mack puts an image of, well, you can just sort of recognize it. It's like I said, it's cubist. It's sort of a cubist interpretation of the Jester's costume. Lots of jagged triangles pointing out here and there. A little photo collage happening because he apparently laid a couple of ornate brass buttons on top of the Jester's image and photographed it. And it's a little Dave McKeanish, really. Then he actually lettered the word Jester on the Jester's fool's cap on the cover. So it's unmistakably a Jester story. And that apparently meant more to me than the fact that it was a Daredevil story. It very often happens. I'm a villain guy, and I will often buy a story starring a hero I don't care that much about if that hero is going up against a villain I do care about. And that's kind of what happened here, because I was all about buying this issue for the Jester. But so anyway, out around the Jester, the broader context of this arc playing to the camera, Nelson and Murdoch's services as a law firm have been secured by an eccentric philanthropist, that is the word I am attempting to enunciate, to sue none other than Daredevil. That's right, Matt Murdock is supposed to sue Daredevil in court for damage Daredevil supposedly inflicted upon this philanthropist's private estate. Daredevil supposedly fell through the glass roof of his greenhouse. The thing is, though, Matt Murdock knows full well that Daredevil, namely him, never went anywhere near this guy's property, so it couldn't possibly have been the real Daredevil who fell through that glass roof, which leaves the question, who was impersonating Daredevil? What was that person doing over there in the area of the philanthropist's house? And how did he end up crashing through its roof? Was he up to no good? Murdoch / Daredevil need to find all of this out. And I guess Murdoch takes the case to deflect any suspicion, or maybe because it'll put him in a better position to investigate this situation in both of his identities. Foggy Nelson, of course, who is actually aware of Daredevil's dual identity at this time, has his misgivings about all of this. Especially when said philanthropist in this issue, part 2 of the story, calls this massive press conference. It's kind of an ambush press conference. Nelson and Murdoch show up expecting to just be consulting with their client one-to-one, and instead there's this media circus set up in which it's announced that Daredevil is being sued. And that does not make Nelson and Murdoch happy either as Daredevil and Daredevil's friend or as lawyers, because they don't want this kind of thing made that public. And things kind of escalate when an additional supporting character named Elaine Kendrick, who is an assistant and research associate for Nelson and Murdoch, who exists in the Marvel Universe just for this arc, basically, just long enough to complicate the events of this story and then vanishes into limbo afterwards. She takes a little too much bright-eyed, eager young law clerk initiative, and she basically makes a public call-out to Daredevil, saying, if you're really the hero you claim to be, show up and allow us to serve you a subpoena to appear in court. Nelson and Murdoch and Daredevil, of course, manage to sidestep this, but then the Jester gets into the act, as only the Jester can. All right, so we get there's one page which shows quick little what they might call in British television vox pops, of just like 5 horizontal panels of reactions to this big public hullabaloo about Daredevil being sued. So we get to see the reactions of Spider-Man, the Black Widow, J. Jonah Jameson, the Kingpin, and at the bottom, Jonathan Powers, a.k.a. the Jester. And somebody apparently contacts the Jester to get himself involved in this public brouhaha. So until the Jester does get involved, Daredevil dodges this public call to get it to be embroiled in court with this philanthropist. Public sentiment is actually in his favor. The public actually rushes Elaine Kendrick and takes from her the papers she plans to serve to Daredevil and scatters them to the winds. But then later on, Powers shows up. The Jester shows up. And he's playing a new role here. I mean, we have to emphasize that the Jester is, in fact, an actor, or at least a frustrated actor. He considers himself an actor. His career has been virtually non-existent in that regard. He couldn't get fired in New York. The title of this part of the playing to the cameras arc is actually A Fellow of Infinite Jest, quote from Hamlet, in honor of Powers, the Jester himself. But here he assumes a new role, not so much as a costumed robber as he's been in the past. And for the Jester, it's not about the money. It's all about the acclaim, the attention he gets from committing crimes and making fools out of heroes, especially gritty urban vigilante Daredevil. So here, he's kind of put aside his role as robber a little bit, and instead, we're told that he's taken a job as public irritant. Well, we're not told in so many words, but we see by the end of the story that he's now more of a public irritant for hire. And you know what? It actually works for the character. Wish I could say the same for the Jester's new costume, though. I hesitate to tell you to do a Google search for it because I don't want to be sent your optometrist bills, but it's really pretty ugly. It's a bright, livid green and purple color scheme. It's a Harlequin color scheme. It's fitting for a Jester, but the design, the cut and the line of the costume itself, the Jester's costume used to be fairly loose and baggy with like long tassels hanging from his cowl and his shoes, and this mask with a long pointed nose, like something straight out of either like a carnival outfit, maybe something from the Feast of Fools, since he is the Jester after all, or something from I've described it in the past as something that from the costume closet of a Commedia dell'arte troupe. It was much more menacing than the outfit he's sporting here. This green and purple thing, it doesn't even have a mask on it. It kind of looks like something that... It makes sense for him as a publicity hound and an aspiring actor. I mean, actors often insist when they're doing these costume things that their faces be visible on screen or on stage for a certain period of time. It's in a lot of their contracts, in fact. So it makes sense that the Jester's new costume would feature a maskless cowl. I mean, it covers all of his head except his face, but his whole face is there, and it's got these stubby little green and purple horns coming out from the top of his head on either side, and the overall effect, he capers and prances, and the costume's too tight on his body. The old one was baggier. It makes him look, I don't know, just too scrawny and almost asexual. The impression is that he's kind of like a praying mantis rent boy. He looks insect-like and also, it just does not work. I mean, I like what is done with the character. I just don't like how he's clothed. And he brags about the fact that this is a new costume. I don't think it was used very much after this arc, thankfully. And now I've devoted more time than I think has ever been devoted by anyone else anywhere to the Jester. And I'm just talking about what he's wearing, for crying out loud. This is like the red carpet report about this B-list villain that very few people care about. But I do, darn it. I care so much. All right, so anyway, he's got this new costume, and it's silly looking, but I guess I said the old costume was creepier, more threatening, but, you know, in this story, he's basically a party clown who's been hired to deliver a singing telegram. He's trying not to project menace for the sake of whoever hired him to do this. He shows up and stages... pun, stages, since he's an actor, stages a bank robbery. He pretends to rob a bank, doesn't actually overtly threaten anyone, doesn't take... he doesn't so much take money as he does strongly suggest that donations would be appreciated, all the while he's twirling one of his deadly toys. The Jester is famous for his arsenal of gimmicked little toys and gewgaws. So he has his favorite deadly toy is a yo-yo, so he twirls it mildly menacingly around his head and manages that way to get people to donate money to him. Then Daredevil shows up on the scene, and he absconds with the loot. Then Daredevil tracks him down, trips him up on a rooftop, and the Jester springs the final surprise on him. He wanted Daredevil to catch him so that he could serve him a subpoena in the case of this philanthropist versus Daredevil. And the last line, the Joker, listen to me, the Jester, since it's kind of obvious, since Daredevil is about the closest thing Marvel has to a Batman, well, with apologies to Moon Knight, I suppose, the Jester, who has also fought Moon Knight on occasion, would be like their Daredevil what the Joker is to Batman. I mean, it's not a perfect analogy. The Jester is a very different kind of character, and I'm kind of happy about that. But the Jester gets the last laugh in this story, and he says, "I hope you have a good lawyer." Yeah, mic drop there. So, yep, that is this issue of Daredevil. It is the last, well, apart from one, it's the last issue of Daredevil I would buy for a long time. It's like a last oasis before Bendis's crime noir totally encrusts the Daredevil character. It's a light, fairly funny story. There's some successfully funny bits in there. Gale's scripting is a little bit vanilla, maybe a little too on the nose at spots. At the time, it probably seemed painfully hokey, especially coming right on the heels, literally right next to the poetic prolixity of Brian Michael Bendis, but I personally like it. You know, it's probably the last time for a while that Daredevil would be written in a mode that I've found pleasant and recognizable as superhero comics. So, but I didn't bother to buy the rest of the arc. I was just in it for the Jester, and he kind of bows. I think he might appear on one or two panels in issue number 22, but for the rest of the 6-issue arc, he's just not there. So I don't even really know what the conclusion of this story is. I don't know what happens to write out Elaine Kendrick from the Nelson and Murdoch law firm. I don't know who the imposter Daredevil was who fell through the roof of that guy's greenhouse. Don't know how it all played out. Don't really care that much, but if any of you out there do know and would like to share with me and anyone else who might happen to be around thecomicforums.com, please do stop in and share your thoughts. I'll invite you more generally and broadly to share thoughts about everything in this episode at the end. Okay, about a little over an hour in, and I've still got a couple of little treasures here in the cargo hold of the time bubble. All right, DC Disciples, sit up and take notice about this one. This is a pretty good DC comic of the early 2000s, pretty significant, especially if you're a fan of The Flash. I recall that my very first time aboard the time bubble, one of the things I talked about was a part of the Jeff Johns run on The Flash, which was so influential and ultimately snowballed into Jeff Johns becoming one of the major architects or creative directors of the DC universe as a whole. But he was first made steward of the Flash's little corner of the DC universe, and he did do some pretty progressive things with it. And we see an escalation of that in the comic I'm about to talk about, which is the Flash Iron Heights one-shot special. 48 pages, prestige format, square bound, glossy paper, which was not universal in 2001 just yet. It was still for special projects, and this certainly was that. It was released in August of 2001. Written, of course, by Jeff Johns. The art team was Pencil's Ethan Van Sciver, so this is the first time, I'm pretty sure at least. I did do some research into it. If I'm wrong, please correct me, but I think this is the first time that the Timo Supremo of Jeff Johns and Ethan Van Sciver collaborated on a comic. And Van Sciver is inked by Prentice Rollins, colors and separations by Chris Chuckry, who also colored that Daredevil comic I just got done talking about. Small industry, what do you know? So, yes, this comic is, it's part of Johns' ongoing pilot programs, plural, because he did have a couple of things he was doing with The Flash during his run as it wore along. One of those programs was to enhance, expand, and elaborate on The Flash's Rogues Gallery, one of the greatest in comics, Johns thought, and many other people obviously thought and think too. But Johns wanted even more people to understand how cool Flash's rogues were, and so he started to develop them both as individuals, as in like one-shot Tales of the Rogues, like the one that he did with Captain Cold, very famously, and also as a group. no, more than that, a class of DC villains. And so this issue plays into that. And also, he was working to instill a genuine sense of place, of local identity. One might go so far as to say of character in DC's time-honored but underexplored fictional cities. And his first stop was Keystone, which is where Wally West, the Flash, called home. And obviously, for a long time, Metropolis and Gotham were very well-rendered and explored cities since Superman and Batman had so many monthly published adventures over the decades. Metropolis and Gotham couldn't help but to develop a kind of local character of their own, to become, in a way, as much character as setting in the stories told about these characters in their respective milieu. And James Robinson came in and created a completely new fictional metropolis in the DC universe, Opal City, for his Starman series. And lots of other writers began to get jealous of what he was doing there, since for so long, traditionally, superheroes in universes other than the Marvel universe, most of whose superheroes just lived in New York, but the Marvel universe tended not to have quite as many fictional cities. But other publishers, DC especially, were just kind of lousy with them, and many of them were just kind of, pale carbon copies of existing cities, and they weren't really given much opportunity to develop character of their own, personality of their own. And it's been said that Metropolis is like New York City above a certain street on the brightest sunny spring day, and Gotham City was more like New York below that same street in the dead of night in the middle of February. And Opal City was famous for its sense of history and all of that. So Johns decided he wanted to play this game too, and this isn't not the last time he would do this either. He would develop other fictional DC cities too, but he began with Keystone City, and he sort of worked it out into this blue-collar industrial center. People were proud. They had a real sense of community spirit. It was home to its own sports franchises. It had a powerful union presence, and in fact, its leading labor union was led by an ex-supervillain, Goldface, Keith Kenyon. So neat little stroke that Johns added there. And so it just kind of developed into this kind of jewel of the Rust Belt is basically what Johns' Keystone was. And this one-shot, Iron Heights, the eponymous prison featured in that title is one of the things that Johns is doing to help continue to build Keystone as setting and character, if you will. And so he'd been going through both of these projects, developing the Rogues, developing Keystone City, and for some time in the Flash Monthly series, and so this one-shot is him taking that kind of a step up, kind of to the next level, and bringing those two projects, sort of densely intertwining them, showing us more about what it means to be a rogue, showing us more what it's like to live in Keystone City, and showing us specifically the frightening new reality of what it is to be a rogue in Keystone City now that this place, this Iron Heights prison, exists. I think I'm going to begin, actually, by talking about the artwork for a change, because it's really top-notch. I really enjoyed the art on this, and if my friend Pants were here, he would probably agree that this is a fondly remembered comic for him, too. It's the story, and, well, the artwork is borne up to new heights, no pun intended, by the inks of Prentice Rollins and Chris Chuckry. I mean, but yeah, with their help, this still, even all these years later, to me, this still stands as some of Ethan Van Sciver's best work to date. I mean, this is... It's reminiscent of Brian Boland in his prime. It's Killing Joke good. Now, in that it's both it's gorgeous and simultaneously disturbing. It's finely detailed, and yet it's also selectively creepily distorted here and there. Sometimes the fine detail actually adds into the creepiness of what's happening in the story, because it is a pretty disturbing tale. It's madness and disease behind the walls of a cruel metahuman prison. It's really not an all-ages story, so it needs to be a little creepy, and by gosh, Van Sciver makes creepy look so good. And there's even a little black and white flashback sequence at the beginning of the story, which flashes us back to, Barry Allen's time as the Flash, and sort of foreshadows and events of the story, and introduces us to one of several new characters found in this one-shot. And it's in black and white, and not only is that... It's a great tone setter and foreshadower, this scene, but it looks great because Chris Chuckry just kind of stands back and lets Van Sciver and Rollins do their thing. Now, Chuckry certainly adds quite a bit to the story as it proceeds from there, but it's just nice to see a little bit of Flash black and white at the beginning to show us what kind of gritty gut-punching, strange, and disturbing storytelling we're in for in the later pages. So, I said that this Iron Heights one-shot is kind of all about both developing the rogues and the setting, and nothing says local color and cachet in a superhero universe quite like a supervillain nut house within your city limits. And so, we have Jeff Johns, who is going about adding Iron Heights to an already fairly full directory of iconic super penitentiaries in the DC universe. I mean, we already had Stryker's Island, Blackgate, Belle Rev, where Suicide Squad calls home, the Slab, and of course, mother or perhaps crazy aunt of them all, Arkham Asylum in Gotham City. And so this is definitely shoving Iron Heights right into the consideration with all of these. I mean, Johns gives it its own flavor, but it's clear that he's kind of going in the direction of Arkham with this. And I think, or at least I like to think, that he has a definite point in so doing. So he's killing two birds with one stone, or boomerang, or weather wand, or mirror, or whatever, by creating a distinctive landmark for Keystone City, in keeping with its heavy-duty industrial portrayal, and it's definitely an industrial facility. Just about everything you see in Keystone, as drawn by Van Sciver and company in this issue, kind of looks pretty badly weather-beaten. There's rust and scoring all over everything. So yeah, Iron Heights is an old kind of a dump, and especially when you get down into the basement, which is basically just, they have human beings locked up in what's basically a maintenance corridor. There's all kinds of exposed pipes and water leakage, and it looks really deplorable down there. So good job to the art team there to help Johns evoke the sense of horror and also this kind of industrial gothic that he's going for with this, which ties in well to the spirit of Keystone as John sees it. And it also hangs a big, ugly, rust-stained lampshade on the darkest side of Flash villainy. Provides it a symbolic spatial epicenter in Iron Heights. We finally have a place where Flash rogues go when Flash catches them and sends them to prison for the umpteenth time. But and it also makes this Flash villain, what it is to be a rogue in Keystone City, noticeably deliberately on John's part, and perhaps also objectionably on the Flash's part, worse than it's ever been. And we're sort of left to surmise what the penal system must have been like in Keystone City before this renovation of sorts that's been put to Iron Heights. It used to be kind of a revolving door. Rogues would be caught, they'd be stuck inside, they'd be out again in a couple of months, robbing the Central City Bank again, but here, something is definitely different here. And we're given to know this pretty clearly. Johns is just canny and also courteous enough to allow Wally, when he finally gets into the prison and sees what's going on, to muse to himself that that something is definitely not right there. He acknowledges through Wally and also through Weather Wizard, who is one of the classic Flash rogues interned in Iron Heights in this story, that there's definitely something, quote, not right down there. Something both, not right in the sense of being unjust, these criminals are being mistreated pretty badly, but also unnatural, something incongruous with the Flash's part of the DC universe. It's just there's this thematic incongruity about Iron Heights. Flash senses it. He says outright, there's a madness in the air, some indefinable, invisible factor, probably due to one of this issue's newly introduced characters, Warden Gregory Wolf, whom I'll get back to in a sec, that is causing the Flash rogues who are imprisoned there to behave more and more like psychopaths, like more and more like Batman villains. So it's sort of like a little bit of radioactive mutagenic Arkhamite. It's, as Krypton is Krypton, you know what I'm saying here, has been placed inside this prison, and it's turning everyone more Batman villainous. And the Flash construes this immediately as a problem. And I do like to think that this is kind of like what Johns is going for here. I mean, I did find myself, as I was reading this, just... Right, I was thinking that a prison for rogues is a great idea, a great addition to the Flash's mythology and to the geography of Keystone City, but it'd have to be quite so similar to Arkham, quite so dark and nightmarish, so inhumane. And then it occurred to me, maybe this is deliberate on John's part, maybe it's rhetorical. Maybe we're supposed to perceive Iron Heights, and I guess by extension Warden Wolf as well, as more like a new rogue in and of itself, a Flash rogue that preys upon other rogues. And perhaps inadvertently, makes them even worse and, brings them more in line with, with what too many other villains in comics in general tend to be. Maybe Johns is trying to make a point here. In addition to giving the Flash kind of another opponent, an opponent that is technically on the same side of the law as he is. So now he's not only fighting the rogues, he's also kind of racing time to rehabilitate them and find ways to thwart them that will not only stop what no good they're doing, but will also keep them out of the horror that is Iron Heights. So it really throws the whole dynamic off kilter. It's just more like a three-way thing now between the Flash and his trying to keep his enemies out of this horrible prison, the rogues on the other side, for their part, playing even dirtier than usual to try to keep themselves out of this horrible prison, and then the horrible prison working against the Flash on the one hand and trying to, imprison the rogues for life on the other. And it's a very different sort of dynamic, and I think it might be a kind of meta statement on Johns' part to show us how much poorer a fictional universe like the DCU would be if all the villains were just costumed, superpowered psychopaths the way the inmates at Arkham tend to be. Now, I like to think that that's what he's going for here, that what's happening in Iron Heights is not supposed to, instead of being presented to us just as the new status quo and welcome to it, it's being framed pretty clearly, and the Flash is cognizant of this as a problem. And that's one thing that the Flash does is, comparing him to Batman here, Batman is really more of a detective and a crime fighter. So he solves mysteries. He solves crimes. But the Flash, whether we're talking about Jay or Barry, and to a lesser extent Wally, since Jay and Barry were both scientists, Wally doesn't have quite their aptitude in the field of science, but he's trying. What the Flash has always done better than a lot of other crime fighters is solve problems by thinking through them and applying principles of science, or pseudoscience as the case may be, to solving those problems. And Iron Heights, I think, is meant to be a problem that Wally, the Flash, needs to solve. He's aware of the horrible conditions in there. He knows that Warden Wolf is up to something not so good by the end of the story, although he doesn't get a chance to do anything about it, to investigate more closely. We still don't know what it is in that prison that is making its inmates act crazier than they ever have. Because, when Wally sees the weather wizard in there, he actually remarks aloud, "Martin isn't this nuts." So it isn't just Jeff Johns trying something slick by giving us a crazier weather wizard. Within the story, we're told that this is not right. This is not the way Flash rogues are supposed to be or supposed to be treated. So it's a new status quo, but it's also a combatable status quo. It's something that maybe is not intended to last forever, but which is good for several cool stories. And as Johns' run goes on, we'll find that that's exactly what happens. Now, as far as the story itself, so the premise, even in 2001, I think, would have sounded something like what you'd find as the storyline in a video game. I mean, the premise is, there's an outbreak of some kind of mysterious plague or pestilence or disease in the Iron Heights prison, and this brings Wally, with some help from, we'll call them non-player characters, Jay Garrick, helping out as a scientist, working with the med techs at the Keystone City Police Department, hoping to work together a cure for this mysterious disease. And then the Pied Piper also shows up and accompanies Wally into Iron Heights, since he, after all, has been a criminal and he has been imprisoned there in the past. They need to go into this place, and they need to run a gauntlet through a wide range of Wally's foes, driven mysteriously, violently insane, to save Keystone City as a whole from this virus. It sounds like something just like the plotline of a video game. It's not unlike what you might have found in, say, Doom or Resident Evil or Silent Hill, all of which I'm pretty sure were out there in the public by 2001. So yeah, it kind of feels that way, and this is many years before the last few Batman first person games, like the Batman Arkham Knight, I think is an example, which is basically Batman going through Arkham Asylum and battling these over the top hyperbolic versions of his famous crazy foes. That's kind of what Wally is doing in this story. So I might even say that this story is ahead of its time. It probably seemed a lot more daring then than it would if it were published today. Although it did, so I still found it quite fairly thrilling, really. Even though I did have, as I said, my misgivings about what Johns may or may not have been doing with the rogues, and And I didn't think it needed to be quite as much like Arkham Asylum, but as I said, I think he was probably working towards a point that the rogues are actually better than this. And so this is kind of him using this Iron Heights prison situation as a way of, well, making the rogues temporarily more dangerous, but also reminding us of what a good thing it is that not everybody in a superhero universe is a Batman villain. You see what I'm saying? There's also a little bit of deft subtext happening. There's one scene on page 22 where Wally and the Piper are breaking into Iron Heights, soon to be horrified by what they find there. And Wally is just making conversation with Piper, and he's talking about his relationships, some minor problems that he's having with his wife, Linda Park, and he's saying, sometimes we have problems, small ones, but we just lock them away and forget about them, hoping they'll disappear on their own. We should just sort it out right then and there. I'm just not good at it. And there we are. That's actually, it is kind of a macro and micro level. It's a thematic parallelism between Wally's personal life with Linda and his life as a superhero. And it kind of lays bare one problematic convention of superhero comics as a whole, the inadequacy of the whole hero-villain cops and robbers story formula. The heroes catch the villains, the heroes just dump them someplace, and we don't always see what happens to the villains when that happens, and then next thing you know, they're back out of prison again and fighting the heroes a second time. So we don't see that much about well, in the Batman comics we certainly do. We see what happens behind bars at Arkham Asylum, plenty of stories told there. But the rehabilitation for supervillains is clearly inadequate, and so it is calling attention to the fact that just taking these bad guys and plopping them in the same deep, dark hole over and over again really isn't that effective. Batman seems perfectly content to just allow Arkham to contain these loonies over and over and over again. They get out, he just puts them back again. He's just obsessive-compulsive enough that this actually kind of suits him. But Wally, when he sees what's going on in Iron Heights, is really very badly disturbed by it, and he realizes that as it is with his relationship with Linda and the necessity of dealing with small problems, just being honest and communicative and trying to solve the problems instead of just hiding them away, locking them away someplace, i.e. in a prison like Iron Heights, is not a good long-term solution. So it's in the future, going forward, Wally gets a little bit more hesitant to have bad guys locked away there. It still happens, but he's just a lot less happy about it. And there is a story a little bit further down the line that Johns tells in the Flash Monthly ongoing called Run Riot, in which Gorilla Grodd stages a mass riot and breakout from Iron Heights, where this whole house of cards that Warden Gregory Wolfe has built there comes tumbling down, where we learn that Wally was completely justified in, deploring what he sees inside Iron Heights. But that little nod to, well, not only the parallelism between Wally's personal life and what's happening at the prison, but also what it reveals about the inadequacy of villains being dumped off in jail, as has traditionally happened for 70 years now of superhero comics. It makes you think about that aspect of the hero-villain dynamic in a way that I personally had rarely thought of in the past. So, inside the prison then, let me jump back quickly and say that Johns also gives us a neat little glimpse of the very healthy family life that Wally enjoys as the Flash in Keystone City. We see him and Jay Garrick together stopping a runaway train. Garrick pleasantly calls out to the engineer and asks him what the problem is and calls him by name. The engineer's name is Ed. And leave it to good old folksy hometown civic defender like Jay Garrick to know everybody's name. It's just part of the community spirit of Keystone City, I guess. And then the Piper shows up. We get some scenes of Wally and Jay and the Piper and Linda all sitting around watching sports together. And so this is all in pretty stark contrast then to the horrors that await behind the walls of Iron Heights. The terrible conditions in which Wally finds old foes and even a few new ones who were introduced in this story. So that was a good contrast, and it's just nice to see Johns working towards further characterization of the stars and the supporting cast. And it also shows that Keystone, despite the fact that it's birthed a horrible place like Iron Heights, is nonetheless a pretty nice place to live. So that there is some of that happening too. And then venturing into the Iron Heights prison, we are introduced to its new a new antagonist, pretty much, for the Flash, a frenemy of sorts. Warden Gregory Wolfe, I've mentioned his name several times. He is a tall, imposing, muscular figure, very sharply dressed in a black suit and necktie. He is, fascistically no nonsense. Weather Wizard is being brought in. He is dressed in his costume, not even the sharp new one that he wore in a recent 2-issue story in the Flash Monthly, but he's back in his old Infantino-designed one, and he has a one-on-one meeting with the Warden, who lays down the law to him, tells him point blank that as far as he's concerned, Martin the Weather Wizard is guilty of murdering his brother Clyde. That's part of the Weather Wizard's origin story. A criminal who shows up at the home of his brother, a scientist who has developed this weather wand invention, finds his brother dead there of a heart attack. Wolfe is convinced that Mark Martin, the Weather Wizard, actually killed his brother. Martin denies it, of course, but Wolfe his word is law in Iron Heights, so that just kind of adds to Martin's sentence as far as Wolfe is concerned. He brutalizes Weather Wizard a little bit, both by hand and also using a mysterious superpower that Wolfe appears to possess, which is a great superpower for someone like the head of a prison to possess. He's what I'm going to call a myokinetic, which means that he has psionic power that allows him to cause people's muscles to contract or relax, to clench up or to just loosen and go limp at his will. He can cause people agonizing pain by doing this. It's a very effective immobilizer or incapacitant. So it's not that exciting for a combatant character, but for a character like Wolfe, whose job is simply to contain villains, not to battle them, it's really kind of perfect. It's the ideal symbolic superpower for a person of his profession. And so he is one bad dude, this Gregory Warden Wolfe. He makes no bones about the fact that he is there to contain these villains at all costs. This is not a revolving door. There are going to be no sessions with therapists. They're not there to be rehabilitated. They're there to be kept away from the innocent general public. And so Martin, the Weather Wizard, after this little session with the Warden, which is also the reader's introduction to the character, heck of a first impression it is, he's dragged off to his rusty cell down in The Pipeline. It's like fans of the CWTV Flash series take note. This is the first time that The Pipeline, as a place for the incarceration of Flash villains, is mentioned. It's not quite as shiny and science-y as the same-named facility at the Star Labs compound on the TV show. It's, like I said, it's basically a maintenance corridor just covered with cockroaches, rust everywhere, leaking water, horribly unsanitary, unhealthy, and, of course, there's whatever's in the air that causes the rogues to slowly go insane. There's no fresh air, there are no windows, and another beautiful little touch from Johns and his artistic collaborators. Note that each door, not only are these characters, this is kind of a dual nod to the Silver Age of comics, actually. Johns is good at doing those. But whenever you saw a jail that contained supervillains back in the old days, in the Silver Age, you would usually see rows of barred doors with the villains just kind of standing there, grinning evilly, wearing their full costumes all the time, with little placards pinned to their cell doors, not with their real names, but with their noms du crime, their alter ego names. So you didn't see Harvey Dent, you'd see Two-Face printed on this little card, and he'd be standing there in his, bi-part suit instead of in like prison grays or an Arkham Asylum uniform or something. He'd be in full dress with his villain name on the bars. So this is what they did in the Silver Age of comics. So Johns is kind of giving us a nightmarish twist on that. The villains are put in their costumes and forced to wear nothing but their costumes the entire time they're in jail. So that's the explanation given is that it is to identify them more clearly as repeat offenders, as masks, as dangerous metahuman criminals. And he says that they're wearing those costumes for one reason and one reason only, so that the guards, the staff, know to shoot on sight if they see them anywhere but inside their cells. I like to think, though, that the additional reason is as a form of aversion therapy. It's like you wear these bright, colorful costumes to draw attention to yourselves. Do these costumes make you feel powerful, charismatic? Well, let's see how powerful and charismatic you feel when those costumes are covered with your own piss and drool, sucker. And so they're forced to wear their work clothes for the whole time they're in the jail. And another neat little slightly chilling detail when you think about it hard enough, going back to those little placards I mentioned that you often see on the doors or the barred gates of the cells of supervillains in Silver Age comics, you see that there are plaques bolted onto the doors of the rusty metal doors of the cells of these different villains, and their names, their real names, and their alter egos, their pseudonyms, are engraved on these metal plaques. So these are engraved metal plaques bolted to the door. They're meant to be permanent fixtures. So it's a little chilling when you consider that these little rooms with these permanent plaques on the doors are meant to be the permanent homes for these rogues going forward. Wolf wasn't just blowing smoke when he said that the rogues' internment was meant to be a permanent measure. He went so far as to create these metal signs for their little quarters, which, as far as Wolf is concerned, they will never, ever, ever leave again, which is not always in keeping with the terms of their sentence. And then let's not forget the human rights violation he commits with one villain who happens to be radioactive in nature, who's locked up in the basement and powers. He's submitted to what is basically torture in order to power the prison with his radioactive bioenergy. So this is none of this is cool. Not at all, as Wally and the Piper Hartley soon discover as they run this gauntlet through the bowels of Iron Heights prison. And as they go, they and we are introduced. Not only do we see a few classic rogues from Flash's Rogues Gallery, so Weather Wizard for one, Dr. Alchemy is in there, but we also are introduced to several new villains who've become fairly prominent figures in the Flash comics. In addition to, well, if we're thinking of Iron Heights and Warden Wolf as villains in and of themselves, in addition to them, that black and white flashback sequence I mentioned at the beginning, that is our introduction to a villain called Murmur. We see Barry Allen in court testifying against him and getting him committed to Iron Heights, and apparently he's one rogue that Iron Heights, even before the Wolf administration, was able to hold. So he's a fairly important character in this story. He's a serial killer who hates noise and has been known to cut people's tongues out. He also sort of muttered and murmured compulsively to himself, and he gave himself away by doing so. So eventually he cut out his own tongue and sewed his lips shut. So that's. He also apparently has some kind of abnormality in his blood that makes him immune to certain chemicals and viral agents. Really, really out there design by Van Sciver and company. It's kind of Tim Burton-esque. He's what I would call a great and pretty rare example of, well, you know how on CGS when we review comics, we're often talking about of a great concept that suffers from weak execution. This is a fairly weak concept as a character, I think, that actually benefited from a great execution. I don't think Murmur is really, when you come right down to it, all that interesting. To me, he's just another like Mr. Jazz or Cornelius Stirk, or just one of a fairly generic clutch of souped-up serial killers that Batman spent a lot of his time fighting, like in the late 80s. So he probably wouldn't have stood out very much at that time, but just the way he's drawn and depicted in this story and the important role he has to play in this story has secured his place in the Flash's history, I think. Whereas otherwise, he might simply have gone ignored. But let's just not forget, he's just so strange-looking, the way Van Sciver and Rollins render him. These long, spindly limbs, the shock of hair at the top of his head, the eyes facing different directions, and, of course, the fact that his lips are sewn shut. Yeah, like I said, Tim Burton could scarcely have done a better character design than that. We're also introduced to Double Down and his deck of cursed playing cards. Girder, who is much more visually interesting in the comics, as we see in this first appearance of his, than he ever is, either as living being or as zombie on the Flash TV show. Girder is so much cooler in the comics, but then again, he doesn't need to cleave to a CW budget in the comics either, as they can afford to make him look as good as they want. And there's kind of a last page cameo of another important rogue, Blacksmith, about which I shall say no more for the moment. So yeah, the rogues are really developed in a couple of different ways here. So it's a cool story all the way around. It's not quite as self-contained as perhaps it should have been, because I get the impression that it was probably originally conceived as like a 2-issue arc of the Flash monthly ongoing. But then they decided to just spin it out and present it as this special one-shot. If you're trying to read your Flash collection in order, I would say that it falls roughly between issues number 176 and 177, because 176 is the second part of that two-part Weather Wizard story I just mentioned, where the Weather Wizard comes back and he's got a new lease on life. He has a better understanding of his powers. So Johns, like I said, Johns was involved in this project, this prolonged program of making the rogues a little more dangerous and interesting, developing them a little more. And so he did his job on the Weather Wizard, and then he promptly takes the Weather Wizard and throws him into Iron Heights, where he's knocked back a peg. He's put back in his old costume, and he's driven a little bit crazy by temporarily, though, at least, by Warden Wolf. So since that Weather Wizard story ended in number 176, this is probably set very shortly after that. And then there are other things that are going on in this one-shot that plants it clearly at a certain point in Johns' monthly continuity for his Flash monthly ongoing series. Like, for example, there's a couple of Linda Park is undergoing a career change, we're told. Then there's Pied Piper is being evasive with the Flash about his recent activities, so that ties into what's been happening and what will happen in the Flash Monthly. And the last page reveal is very clearly something that's going to be followed up on in the Flash ongoing. So this story is not really an island. So if you might want to check out the 170s. Numbers of Johns' Flash run to contextualize this story properly, but it's a pretty wicked read. The art-wise, at least, it holds up very well even today. I mean, if you're a fan of the Batman video games that have been out recently, this is probably going to seem a little bit like that, except with the Flash and Flash's villains. So it may be a little past the time to read it if you're into that sort of thing, but for the art, certainly, it's well worth a read. It's an influential comic of its time, and it's a kind of a jewel in a run that's very fondly remembered and highly thought of by Flash fans and DC Comics fans in general. Flash Iron Heights. Pleased to mention it on the Time Bubble. All right, one more thing to talk about at any real length here in detail, and that's going to be back to Marvel again, and a return to a Marvel series of that time period that has been fairly controversial, and which I have addressed somewhat on the Time Bubble in the past. And I promised I would come back to at some point, and I'm doing it now. Let's take another look at Grant Morrison's New X-Men. Yeah, that's right. But not an issue of the ongoing series, though. We're looking at the New X-Men Annual 2001. Yeah, there were some annuals happening at Marvel in 2001. Both New X-Men and Joe Casey's Uncanny X-Men did have annuals, and something special was done with those annuals that year. They were printed in glorious horizontal widescreen format. That's right, they were horizontally oriented, so that instead of being, the spine was at what would normally be the top of the comic, in other words, so that the pages were all as wide as they normally were tall, and vice versa. So fairly short pages, but long pages, so that... Oh, just a minute. I need to do a quick measurement. All right. It would seem that when these issues were laid open and flat upon a table, from one side of one page to the other side of the other page, 20 inches across. So yeah, like I said, widescreen format, going for that cinematic feel that Morrison has at times felt is so important to superhero storytelling. And we get it here, 48 pages of it, minus ads, of course. And we also got it in the Uncanny X-Men Annual, although I didn't happen to pick that one up. I did buy the Grant Morrison New X-Men one. So it is written by Morrison, of course. This is set in his new vision for the X-Men, this new millennial vision of his. The pencils are done by Lionel F.U., inks by Jerry Alanguilan, and the colors are by our friends over at Hi-Fi Design, Brian Miller and his bunch. And it's the story apparently takes place shortly after the E for Extinction arc, which was Morrison's first arc of New X-Men. Issue number 116 had a cover date of September of 2001, because Professor X, we're told in this story, is out as a mutant. He's revealed his mutancy to the world, and Funnily, though, it sort of flashes forward a little bit, too, in that we get a little glimpse of things to come, in that we're told that the X Corporation has been founded and offices have been opened around the world. This is something that was not officially announced in the X-Men comics, in the new X-Men timeline, until sometime in 2002. But the X Corporation is sort of a factor in this story. So it's a little chronologically ambiguous, but we sort of thrive on that kind of thing here aboard the Time Bubble. But anyway, it is a part of Grant Morrison's new X-Men. It's not the Frank Quitely artwork we're accustomed to for that. But it's really the tone of the story is a little different from what he was doing in the new X-Men Monthly. It's fairly fast-paced and splashy and shallow. I've struggled in the past with the right adjective to describe just what Morrison was doing with New X-Men, and with a number of other things he's written over the years. I think I settled on neotropic, and that he was attempting to create new ideas and concepts and sort of integrate them into existing superhero concepts and steer them into strange, mind-expanding new worlds. So this seems built to be less neotropic than other new X-Men material. Instead, I think, as hinted at by the cinematic scope, the cinema scope, there's a go in a phrase, of the widescreen, horizontally oriented artwork, he seems to be going more for a super edgy, popcorn-fueled, high-adrenaline, like Hong Kong sci-fi action thriller with this one. So it's not so much conceptual, not a lot of deep thought or big ideas, but it's more about the action. And so it comes through in that regard. It's something of an important story in that it's the first appearance of a couple of characters that are pretty intimately associated with this period of X-Men comics. For one thing, the villain is one John Sublime, who's presented to us here as kind of like a self-help guru and infomercial maven. He's got a line of books, and he's selling this philosophy of transmutanity, however he wants to call it. The idea is that human beings can be mutants born into non-mutant bodies, and there needs to be some way for them to cross over. There are probably some readers who would consider his whole line kind of transphobic, but he's talking about how to actuate your inner mutant. He writes a book called The Third Species, and he talks about how flat scans, as the mutants would call them, Homo sapiens, can tack the superior onto the end of their names and become something that is neither human nor mutant, and in a way better and more self-realized than either. So he's got this whole spiel that he does. And on the sly, not part of his public literature, he also has a mutant organ trade agreement with China, because apparently the official line of the communist Chinese state for quite some time has been to execute most mutant children upon birth. And so when the state gets their hands on mutant children, they need something to do with them. So I guess they work out some kind of agreement with Sublime and his vast fortune so that some kind of quid pro quo happens that they kill these mutant kids that they capture and sell the organs to him to graft onto himself and other members of his little organization. He has some human mutant grafted henchmen that he calls U-Men that seal themselves away in these big armored battle suits and refuse to touch the earth or breathe the air of this polluted, tainted world until the third species is taken over, basically. So that's the deal with the U-Men. They're Sublime's henchmen. And Sublime, he's a pretty creepy villain in this story when he's not fully realized or revealed, because he's the kind of guy who just commits atrocities with a big, warm, telegenic grin and some folksy, amiable Southern expressions. You know, he's a fine, over-the-top, abominable, like, sci-fi action satirical genre villain. He's a little like Arcade in his demeanor and his showmanship and also his fashion sense. He does seem to favor white suits. But a little twist he also kind of reminds me of Gary Oldman from The Fifth Element, just neither here nor there. But what we don't know about him yet in this, and forgive me if this is spoiling things for anyone, but he eventually turns out to be not so much a human being as a living, intelligent colony of bacteria who's existed since the Stone Age and who sees mutant kind as a threat. So he's kind of manipulating the media and everyone and everything else it can to try to neutralize mutants as a threat. And so this whole business with the third species and the U-Men is just a part of this bacterial entity's scheme. So Sublime becomes even more horrific when you know that about him. But this is Sublime's first appearance. It's with all this, it kind of reminds me of that classic X-Men story where the X-Men and Factor 3 go up against the Mutant Master, who turns out not to be a mutant or even a human being, but an alien. Big, slimy octopoid thing that's, I guess, kind of a comparable reveal to a guy being an intelligent bacteria colony. So, I'd be willing to bet Morrison has read that story. Another character who first appears in this tale, in this annual, is Zorn, the man from Room X. And so this is a lot. The story's pretty much all set in Hong Kong. So there's a lot of stuff happening with the Chinese government and their stance on mutants. And there's this one particular mutant. The story opens with this full horizontal page splash of Zorn sealed up in Room X with word balloons saying, "Zorn, you have a new master now." And that is his Chinese government handler, himself a mutant, by the name of Ao Jung, who has one of the most disgusting mutant powers ever conceived. Basically, he's able to form like big homuncular clones of himself out of every kind of exuvia or leaving that his body makes. If any, he sheds skin cells, hair, eyelashes. He can grow it up into these grotesque Gollum-like shambling duplicates of himself, semi-intelligent, and he can control them mentally. Just as well that this character pretty much doesn't outlive his first appearance, but it's quite a power he's got going on there. Probably if Morrison were in a scatological mood, he could have done some really nauseating things with a character like. But anyway, Ao Jung is the person who's in charge of Zorn and his jailer, and he's making a deal with Sublime to sell Zorn to him. Zorn is his superpower, by the way, is that he has a miniature star where his brain should be. So huge source of potential source, at least, of energy and gravitic force. He wears this special metal helmet, so he's a guy with a star for a brain. He has powers that are sort of similar to that of a black hole. From what I hear, I think the story in this issue with him is that he was a Chinese peasant right around either during or just after maybe around the time of the Korean War, late 40s, early 50s, something like that, whose mutant power manifested, and then like 2 days later, the star inside of his head ate and replaced his brain, and his powers were unleashed, and Chinese military forces came in and took him prisoner and locked him up in a facility named for the central city of hell in Chinese mythology. Feng Tu, I think it was called. And so he was locked up in Room X, and this helmet put on his head, and he was just kind of strapped into this big electric chair-looking thing, where he sat there like that for like 50 or 60 straight years. He was the man in Room X for that whole time. Kind of shades of the man in the Iron Mask, I suppose, when you come down to it. But then in this story, the X-Men learn of him by accident, and by the end of the story, he's loose. He's about to unleash his powers to accidentally destroy the world. Cyclops, of all people, and uncharacteristic of Morrison, he's actually paying some attention to and making use of previous continuity from the X-Men's books before he took over, acknowledging the fact that Scott Summers was possessed by Apocalypse for a time, and the two were merged, and Scott, having been used and possessed in that way, he was sort of sensitive to the plight that Zorn found himself in. He was able to, with a little telepathic assistance from Emma Frost, talk Zorn down and even offer him a place with the X-Men in New York. And so that's kind of where the story leaves Zorn. This is how we're introduced to Zorn and how he comes to be a part of the new X-Men team. As I understand it, the backstory for Zorn is actually rather tamer and keyed down a bit from Morrison's original concept, which I think involved Zorn being one of the first mutants ever born on this planet, even older than Apocalypse, like going back to the Stone Age. But I guess they toned it down then so that he was just a Chinese peasant with a star for a brain. Just toned it down to that. And then, of course, they ramped it back up again by the end of Morrison's run by revealing certain other things about Zorn and his true identity, maybe. I'm not even going to touch that right now. This podcast is running long enough as it is. But anyway, this is the first appearance of Zorn in all his glory. And Zorn is actually a fairly minor detail of the plot as a whole, though. It's mostly X-Men action, as I said before, as they visit Hong Kong to investigate the murder of an employee of the X Corporation, who is a pre-existing X-Universe mutant character, but one that didn't have that many fans, I guess you could say. The X-Men's involvement in this story and in the plight of Zorn is precipitated by the murder of Risk, of all people. She was a minor member of X-Force back in the mid-'90s. Her mutant power is to super compress matter to cause things to implode. And so she's very much a 90s character. She doesn't even appear in this story. That's the really tragic thing. And I kind of cluck my tongue at Morrison a little bit for going along with this. But, this being 2001, it was still pretty fashionable in those days to just take the piss out of the 90s. It's still fashionable to do that now, but at least nostalgia has nostalgia has suffused, there's a good choice of verb, the 90s now. It has crept back into it and allowed people to think back on it a little more fondly. So we have things that are more like tributes to the 90s, things like the current X-Men 92 ongoing series. But characters from the 90s kind of had targets painted on their backs as of 2001. So poor Risk ends up being killed off-panel. We don't even see her dead body at any point in this issue. We're just told that she was murdered. Her old X-Force teammate, Domino, whom is introduced to us by... She's given a real name by Morrison here. I could be wrong, but I don't believe she ever had one before. Morrison just decides that Domino's real name is Beatrice. And she's called that by the other X-people several times in the story. I think Morrison somebody eventually retconned that, so that her real name was something else, Nina something, I think, and Beatrice was then established as her mother's name or something. I'm not even sure, but another 90s character who's not being given... She's certainly being treated better than Risk. She's shown as a competent operative, as she's using her luck powers a little more flagrantly than other writers have dared to, thanks to Morrison. But she doesn't even seem upset very much by the death of Risk. And owing to some flaw or miscommunication or some miskeying on the part of the letterers, I'm checking the credits here to see who the letterers are, Comic Craft's Saida Temofonte. And it seems that there was some kind of a miscommunication about the lettering because, you see, Risk's real name is... it's where is it? Gloria Dolores Munoz. Okay, M-U-N-O-Z. And apparently the N with the tilde over it was miskeyed, or maybe the font didn't have that character in it. It came through in the comic as Mu-Oz. The N with the tilde over it became a hyphen instead. So they kill the poor Risk. They don't even show her body. There's not much of a... We're told, Wolverine quips in one panel that they're going to Hong Kong for a funeral. The funeral is never shown. Nobody seems to shed any tears about poor disposable Risk, and that they don't even get her name right. I just feel too much empathy for the minor characters. And, thinking back to Morrison's Animal Man run in the late 80s, he used to feel pretty empathetic towards minor retconned or killed characters himself. I think of that time that Kurt Busiek was working on the Avengers, and he asked that a minor member of the Squadron Supreme be spared the fate that awaited him in a story that Busiek wasn't writing, saying that please don't kill this character. I will use him in the Avengers. I just don't feel comfortable sending him to his death. And this is a minor fictional character. Busiek felt that kind of empathy for him, and I think I do too for Risk. And I'm a little ashamed of Morrison for treating Risk as shabbily as he does in this story. But anyway, once all the X-Men were over there in Hong Kong, Risk gets them over there. They have a mystery to solve, investigation to conduct, and the action unfolds from there. You get to see Wolverine battling like ninja people, corporate hench people. Domino is doing some pretty cool stuff. The X pheromones are on in overdrive here, and and early 2000s X-person X Stacy, whose mutant power was super pheromones, wasn't even in this story. But you have Wolverine and Domino flirting madly with each other, strongly suggested, if not outright stated, that they will be spending some time in bed after it's all over. And then there's Scott and Emma Frost. There's beginning their dalliance in this issue. The affair that they're going to end up having eventually is... You see Emma, the White Queen, hanging around in her slinky lingerie and holding a pair of wine glasses, leaning on the jams of Scott's bedroom as they're at the X-Corp headquarters, investigating all of this. And in the course of their investigations, they do eventually find Zorn and set him free. And they also encounter a very creepy visual. Props to Lionel Yu for this. They find a little mutant girl whose body is that of a caterpillar, basically, like a very large, say, 20-foot-long, fleshy caterpillar with lots of little chubby baby arms squirming around in different directions, much like the multiple limbs of a caterpillar would be positioned and would move. She apparently had wings at one point, too, but Sublime ripped them off and grafted them onto his own body. And this little caterpillar child, this mutant, dies on Hank McCoy's operating table from loss of blood. And, Hank doesn't seem especially broken up about this, so I guess Morrison has decided to just ectomize pathos from this story altogether for the sake of action. That's what I'm getting from this anyway. So, so it is definitely a story of its time, and it's a tonal departure from what Morrison was doing in the New X-Men. So even as he's trying something new with the X-Men, he's trying something new from the something new that he's trying. So he was really experimenting here. You have to give him credit for that, even if you don't necessarily like the results. On the art end, Lionel F. Yu's art, maybe it's just the inks that are too heavy for me, but it's all kind of, it's all too much splotchy and shadowy for me. And as I said, some of the images are fittingly disturbing, so he does a good job with that. And I'll also say for this, in terms of draftsmanship, I don't think Yu uses the super wide page orientation to its fullest effect. I think there's only one or possibly, well, at most two images that take the whole 20-inch two-page splash. And that is really... It's just an image of Zorn coming out from the wreckage of his prison and seeing the sunset and remarking, "How strange, the world seems so much smaller than I remember." And there's this big, sort of Lawrence of Arabia-worthy, big widescreen cinemascope image of the wreckage of the prison behind him, the big golden sun wreathed in clouds before him, and him standing there tiny in the foreground with this glittering diamond star of a head atop his shoulders as he spreads out his arms to greet his freedom. It's a neat image. It's really cool, but there are many other cooler things that you could have done, and I just feel like opportunities were missed here. The Uncanny X-Men Annual, done in the same format from 2001, has art by Ashley Wood. I have not read it, but if somebody else out there has, I'm kind of curious if you think that he did a better job of taking advantage of that format than I think you did. That's Lionel Yu, not you listening. Don't mean to confuse anyone. One last note, something that blew my mind as I was reviewing this, or rereading this to review it, and that I don't think I noticed, maybe I did, maybe I didn't, when I read the first issue of Morrison's E for Extinction arc. The new X-Men cover logo is exactly the same, upside down or right side up. The NEW are stylized such that, yeah, it's identical. Either way, there's a sort of vertical symmetry happening there. That is kicky. Blow your mind. All right, so there you go. New X-Men Annual 2001. Now, I do have a few other dainties here to share with you. What I like to call either quick pops or tiny bubbles. Two names that I like equally well. And these are just really quick shot reviews, not full length. Other things that I liked and wanted to mention, but didn't want to devote that much time to. I've got first of them is something that's sort of time-related, so far be it from me not to give it a mention here. It's something that I enjoyed reading as well. It's the second volume of the John Byrne Elseworlds. That was still a concept, but just barely in the early 2000s. Elseworlds miniseries, Superman and Batman, Generations 2, An Imaginary Tale. The first volume, it's a 4-issue miniseries. There was one other 4-issue miniseries before that. I want to say like 1997, 1998 at the latest. And I read the 4 issues of that as it was coming out, which I almost never do. Just bumped it right up to the top of the pile because I thought the idea behind it was so interesting. So it is, as the title implies, an imaginary tale. And it asks the hypothetical question, what if Superman and Batman really did first appear in, at about the time when they first appeared in comics, 1938 and 1939 respectively, and had been allowed to age in real time, have kids, have grandkids, have great-grandkids. What effect, without any kind of silly contrivances like, whatever Roy Thomas did to prevent heroes like Superman and Batman and Jay Garrick and so forth from aging on Earth 2. Some kind of magical encounter with Ian Carcole, that I think. It was in one of the All-Star Squadron annuals. What if that hadn't happened? What if instead these characters all aged in real time? Some of the other characters died out. Generations of inheritors of the Superman and Batman roles came about. The Justice League supplanted the Justice Society. What would happen in a world where Superman and Batman were present from the beginning of all this and were able to be a part of superheroics in the DC universe at every stage? Another way to state this question might simply be, what would have happened if, in the post-crisis DC universe, the Earth 2 Superman and Batman characters had been the dominants instead of the Earth 1? So that we could have had Superman and Batman in the Golden Age as part of the Justice Society and allow the rest of post-crisis history otherwise to unfold. And it's all from the mind and pen of John Byrne, who both wrote, drew, inked, and lettered the thing. Trish Mulvihill did the colors. And so the Generations 2 is pretty much the same thing as the first volume. It's just it answers the same question, just at different spots. Each of the 4 issues of the original Generations miniseries had 2 stories in it. One of them set in in the first issue there was one 1939 story showing us the very early beginnings of Superman and Batman's careers. Then the next story was set in 1949. The next issue had stories set in 1959 and 1969, and so on, all through the end. This one, the first issue of Generations 2, shows us a story that takes place in 1942, and the second story takes place in 1953. So, same continuity, same timeline, same general grouping of characters, just different incidents sampled from this timeline that Byrne has come up with. And the covers of all 4 issues interlock into one big image. And along the bottom of it, you can see Batmobiles through the ages, all designed or redesigned by Byrne. And there are guest appearances all along the way by other DC characters, members of the JSA, for example, in this one. You see the Black Hawks, the Spectre, Hawkman, and so forth. And lots of supporting characters from DC Comics Past, and new supporting characters that are members of the Superman and Batman families devised by Byrne. It's a fun read. It really is. If you're into DC history, and it gives Byrne a chance to play around with concepts that he himself played a part in banishing from DC history. So yeah, I definitely do recommend Generations. There's even a third Generations, which I'm just getting started reading. So I'll give you more about that a couple of years from now. Then we have something from Cartoon Network Comics, published by DC back in 2001. It's the 6th issue of Cartoon Cartoons, and it stars the cast of Space Ghost, Coast to Coast. And the title of the story is Go Space Ghost Manga, Go! The whole issue is black and white, and it's a manga parody, like an action manga parody. It's written by Andy Merrill, who, if you don't know, actually did some writing and provided the voice of Brack for Space Ghost Coast to Coast, and later The Brack Show on Cartoon Network. And there's a cover by C. Martin Croker, who did the voice of Zorak on Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Zorak is certainly in this story. The art is provided by Walter Gomez and Robert Pope. Robert Pope does all the manga-style black and white artwork, which is, I've read some manga, and it's convincingly, a style. There are many different styles of manga art, of course, but it's believably Japanese-derived. The dialogue is written in such a way as to, parody the poor translations of anime that have been, and manga too, I guess, that have been imported to the United States, in the decades before the 2000s, like pre-millennial manga imports. It probably wouldn't come across very well to a manga consumer nowadays. It would seem tragically unhip and at best, and probably xenophobic at worst. This is one of the last times when a parody of the idea of Japanese comics, poorly translated Japanese comics, could really fly in a mainstream setting. And to be honest, it's not really all that funny, but it's kind of an interesting historical artifact. And as I said, it involves several people who were involved in the creation of the Space Ghost Coast to Coast TV series. I've got issue number 14 of Tom Strong here from America's Best Comics, written, of course, by Alan Moore. There are a few stories in here with artwork by such worthies as Al Gordon, Chris Sprouse, Todd Klein, letterer, and the lead feature is a Space Family Strong story, which is done in the style of, tales calculated to drive you mad, just EC Comics' humor title of the 50s. And the artwork there is provided by Hilary J. Barta. It's kind of a hoot. Then I have got JSA Secret Files and Origins number 2, cover dated September 2001, which has some Jeff Johns written content. Leading into the Stealing Thunder story involving Johnny Thunder and the Ultra Humanite. So lots of little tidbits of character development happening there, and also plot foreshadowing. There's a story written by D. Curtis Johnson of the underappreciated late 90s gem Chase, with co-plotted by his collaborator on that series, J.H. Williams III, although Williams does not draw this little story. It's drawn by Rick Burchett. But it's a little bit about Mr. Bones, who was the director of the DEO, where Chase worked, Department of Extranormal Operations, and also a former Infinity Inc. villain. So the summer of 2016 for me is the summer of rereading the entire Infinity Inc. series, since I finally bought all the issues out of various back issue bins. So seeing Director Bones in here is kind of fun for me. Then there's a little story about Roulette, who would soon become a major JSA antagonist. And, of course, there's all the profile pages and other little goodies that one expects from the Secret Files and Origins series of extra-sized informational one-shots that DC was doing in the late 90s and early 2000s. This is the second one, as I said, of the JSA that they have done. And it is fairly entertaining, and if you're reading the JSA, if you've read the JSA monthly, you should probably buy this one and read it as a lead-in to the Stealing Thunder story, which is pretty awesome. And last but not least, an issue of Detective Comics, number 761. Oh, God, the cover design they were using for the Batman titles at this time is so Art Deco as to be virtually unreadable. But there is the issue number 761, written by Greg Rucka, art by Sean Martinborough, inks by Jesse Delperdang, and here we find Sasha Midnight, Bruce Wayne's bodyguard, who has recently discovered that Bruce Wayne is secretly Batman, being taken fully into Batman's confidence, and being given the Batman sidekick extreme crash course to see if she has the stuff to help Bruce Wayne, not only as Bruce Wayne, but also as Batman. And she ends up making the grade, and the next time we see her, she'll be in a mask and costume. So it's kind of important for that reason. But the backup story is part 3 of the ongoing Trail of the Catwoman backup, written by Ed Brubaker with art by, bringing it full circle, the late Darwyn Cooke. Some pretty cool pulpy lettering by Sean Conant. It's just a good, hard-boiled detective story in general. Just shows the versatility of Cooke, that he can bring across humor, violence, pathos, all in the artistic sensibility that comes, well, as I've said before, it's inspired as much by like 50s advertising as anything else. And he still makes it all look so good, and he tells stories so capably with it. We're all going to miss him. But, yep, that's part 3 of that Trail of the Catwoman. You'll want to pick up Detective Comics number 759 if you want to read it from the beginning. And so, that brings us to the end of our 2-hour tour here aboard the Time Bubble. Hope you've all enjoyed yourselves, whether this is your first time or if you're a repeat customer. I hope you liked what you heard. I'm going to close, as I usually do, by inviting everyone to swing by thecomicforums.vanillaforums.com to leave a little bit of feedback about this episode, what you liked, what you didn't like, if you had any personal responses to or recollections of the comics I talked about here, or other comics related to the comics I talked about in this episode. Please do share. This time machine trip down memory lane is for everyone, after all, and I like to hear you talk back to me, not only about what I'm talking about, but about how I'm talking about it. Always looking to improve. So hopefully what you've heard tonight is to your liking. We aim to please here aboard the Time Bubble. And with any luck, as opportunity, inclination, and above all else time allows, I'll be back to you with more slightly backdated back-issue reviews aboard the Time Bubble in the near future. In the meantime, keep on reading. Never let your back-issue stash get as large and daunting as mine has become over the years, my friends, not all of you can work a spin-off podcast out of the deal. And let me just reassure you that I will see you next time.